Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor E.J. Milner-Gulland, who is the Tasso Leventis Professor of Biodiversity at the University of Oxford. Her research in wildlife conservation has focused on wildlife trade and wildlife consumption. She wears lots of hats, so you may know her through the Sligo Conservation Alliance. She's also the person who, about a decade ago, gave me the chance to study wildlife conservation. So I'm extremely pleased to be inviting her to speak to you all tonight. EJ, it's down to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and thanks to everybody for coming, and thanks for the invitation. So I am going to talk about how COVID relates to wildlife trade, and I think, you know, it's been, as Mark said, a really difficult time, but I think we've had some lessons for conservation that have come out of these last few months, and so I thought it might be useful just to kind of give a broad overview of how COVID-19 and the wildlife trade interact and how that fits into the bigger picture of biodiversity conservation. And I'm going to start off by playing a little video for you. So if you just give me a sec, I will start the video.
Dear humankind, thank you for being a superhost. I never imagined I'd have the opportunity to jump to a species as abundant as you. Most viruses only get to know their original host animal. Many exist entirely in the humid understory of a remote rainforest. We viruses are kept in check by healthy environments with diverse and abundant wildlife. But when you rip forests apart and capture billions of animals to feed your insatiable appetite for flesh and false cures, you bring viruses like me out of our natural quarantines. You introduce us to new hosts, like you. A superhost of 8 billion individuals and counting. A walking, flying, swimming human meat market. You make up a third of all mammals on Earth by weight. The animals you grow to feed yourselves outweigh all the wild mammals and birds on the planet. As you drive our natural wildlife hosts to extinction, you throw us life rafts bigger than the Titanic. Why wouldn't I jump? As sinister as I may seem, it is not in my interest to wipe out my hosts. We all need other life to thrive. So if this sickness in your bodies opens your eyes to the deeper sickness in our shared planet, it will be to all our benefit. But my big question to you is this: am I enough? If apocalyptic fires aren't enough, if vanishing glaciers aren't enough, if super hurricanes aren't enough, is the cold shadow I cast across the lives of you and your loved ones enough for you to finally confront the prospect of your own extinction? Only you, humankind, can choose to be the cure to the deeper sickness. Only you can choose to nurture the ancient oceans, forests, and grasslands that nurture you, to bring back the chorus of birds and monkeys to silent rainforests, and to make wise choices every day in what you consume and how you live. By protecting nature in all its wild and wonderful forms, you protect yourselves. As the earth stops to take a collective deep breath, you have a rare opportunity to reimagine and redefine a new future. So tell me, what future do you choose?
Okay, so that's pretty hard hitting. And I think most conservationists would pretty much agree with the analysis that's in that video. So if you look at this website, which is by a couple of big NGOs and also endorsed by a number of other big NGOs, it kind of scroll down and you start to think about, and they start to say, okay, so what can you do? Make your choice. And again, most conservationists would look at these choices and say pretty clearly, I choose to end extinction. I choose not business as usual. You scroll further down this website, and the first thing that they say we should do is to end the wildlife trade. And you don't need to read all the words because I'll tell you them shortly. And I thought, okay, right, that's fine. But what's the next thing that we should do to kind of relate to this rather complex systemic issue that they put in the video? And sadly, that's it, you know, so it's share a graphic, use a badge, tell your friends, and so on. So, so really they're saying all is complexity and we should end the wildlife trade. So just going back to my, my PowerPoint. This is what they suggest: to permanently end the commercial trade and sale in markets of wild terrestrial animals and consumption worldwide. I've put the bold in. So my question for us today is, okay, is this a good idea? So it looks like a good idea for a number of reasons. So this is a simple, clear call. We can rally behind it. It recognises the link between wildlife trade and zoonotic disease, which is well established. Sounds pretty feasible. And they've clearly separated out subsistence users. So they're talking about commercial wildlife trade only. But I guess my work on the wildlife trade says that the reality is not quite so simple. And so we'll be talking about how you would actually do this. Would it actually reduce pandemic risk, and would it have a major conservation benefit? So in order to think this through, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the wildlife trade in Asia and in Africa, which are the two places where this is mostly being thought about. So in Asia, the wildlife trade is very complex. So it's for all sorts of different reasons. So not just for food, which is where they're focusing, but also for medicine for pets, for ornaments for pets. It's sold both in fairly modern pharmacies and also in traditional markets and traditional shops. Importantly, the wildlife trade includes both wild caught and captive bred animals, and I'll come back to that. And some of the animals and plants that they get are locally sourced, and some of them are imported from all over the world. So if you were to try to stop the consumption of wildlife, how would you do it? And I think one of the key things that we've been trying to push in my research program is thinking about it in a strategic way. So trying to understand with the evidence about how people are consuming, who's consuming and why, then using that evidence to make an intervention, assess that intervention, and then learn. And I'll just be giving you a couple of examples from my team's work about how we've been doing that to give you some feel. But I'll just start by saying, why do I think that there's a problem? And it's that many people have been intervening in the wildlife trade for some time now in Asia, trying to reduce demand. And, you know, lots of very well-known NGOs. So one of my students, Alegria Almedo, in 2018, went to Vietnam, which is where they have quite a lot of people intervening for rhino horn, which is a traditional medicine ingredient. And at the time she was working, there were 10 different NGOs that were working in Vietnam to try to reduce the consumption of rhino horn. So she looked at this kind of intervention wheel that I talked about before, that you have objectives, you do research, you find out what your audience is, then you try to change behaviors based upon some understanding of how to do it, then you have some indicators and evaluate what you've done and learn. So we've just put this wheel round with the NGOs concerned mapped onto it. And what we can see here is that only one NGO really had objectives that would be measurable, so you would know whether you'd actually done the job that you wanted to do. Only one had indicators of success. 2 did evaluations, but neither of them were what you would call a robust evaluation. So although people are intervening, they're not intervening in a way that would allow them to know whether they've done it right, or that's based necessarily on any theory. So we set out to try to do it a little bit more in a more of a science-based way. And I'm just going to give you one bit of example of work from Alegria's work again. This is her PhD now, to try to find out how common wild meat consumption was in terms of pangolin consumption in Vietnam. So pangolins consumed in 3 ways, and sorry about the pictures. One is meat, and that is what you would call a wildlife food. So that would be the thing that would be addressed by this call for consumption ban. Scales is a medicine, so that's something that's actually legal in many places and not covered. And then also as wine, and that's as a tonic, but also in restaurants. So people, because it's illegal in Vietnam at least to consume any pangolin product, if you ask people directly, they won't admit to doing it. So in this graph here, we've got the proportion of people out of 1,000 people who said that they'd consumed each of the different kinds of pangolin, and the purple bar is the people who said directly that they had done it, and you can see it's a very, very small proportion. However, when you ask them in a way that allows them to hide their identity and answer anonymously, you get much higher prevalences. So between kind of 6 and 10% of the people we asked had consumed pangolin products of various kinds over the last year, which is pretty high actually in a big city. And this is one of many big cities in Vietnam that's where pangolins are consumed. So that's just one example from pangolin, which is something that's consumed as a meat. I'm going to move to another species now in order to go a little bit further through this kind of behavioral change thing, and it's sigers. As Mark said, I love sigers, and so there's an ulterior motive for why I'm talking about sigers other than just the research. They're beautiful creatures. But one of the things about sigers is that their horn is used in traditional medicine, and it's found in various different forms. I've put some pictures up there. So sold as horns, and then you scrape it, you boil it up, the scrapings, and you have it in tea as a fever-reducing medicine. Singapore in particular is a problematic place because it's a place where a lot of people are consuming it in the form of a cooling water. So it's kind of like a Gatorade or a Lucasade. They consume it as a kind of tonic for feeling feverish. They call it heatiness. Widely on sale, despite the fact that it's a critically endangered species that in the countries concerned, there's been a moratorium on sales of Saiga horn for 10 years. So the first thing to think about after the prevalence is why people are consuming it. And this is work that was done by another PhD student of mine, Hunter Doughty. So she did a large survey in Singapore and found that 19% of people said that they use Saiga horn as their most frequent cure for this heatiness thing, which is like a cold and fever. And if you ask people why, the vast majority say because it works. And this is despite the fact that this horn is basically keratin. And then the next largest is because someone recommended it to me, and mostly that's friends and family, as well as kind of traditional pharmacists. So having understood that, then you can do a lot of detailed research to try and understand who you should intervene with. So who's the pinch point? If you've only got one kind of group of people that you can intervene with, who should you do? And based on a lot of surveys, focus groups, key informant interviews, and literature reviews, Hunter decided on middle-aged Chinese Singaporean women. And that's because they buy this product often and they buy it for other people, including their children and their grandchildren. And so that kind of perpetuates the view that it works. We also decided to do an online intervention, and that's because these people look online for information and they're heavy users of social media. And also, interestingly, when we first started, we thought we would do a health message. Don't use Saiga tonic because it doesn't work, or don't use Saiga tonic because you don't know where it comes from. But actually, what resonated most with this audience in focus groups was a conservation message about the endangerment of this species. So we went with that. And finally, it was a locally focused message, and that's because Singaporeans trust their own media and their own scientists, and they care about what other Singaporeans do. They don't care so much about the wider world. So based on that insight, Hunter did an intervention which used the kind of black ops of Google ads, Facebook ads, the kind of thing that people use to influence elections, but turned it to good, so turned it to conservation. So we have a core message which comes from her research and from other research about conservation, which is that saigers are critically endangered and therefore you shouldn't be using it. And then we managed to get that message into the most respected local newspaper, which is the Straits Times, under the byline of a local reporter. So it didn't come from the University of Oxford, it came from a local reporter. And it quoted our colleagues and our collaborators in the Singaporean University. That was then picked up by other news outlets, kind of in an organic way. And then we were able to repost and kind of amplify that message in many different forms through these ads. and then also point people towards past resources that gave more information in case people were seeking information. So here's an example of one of the seed sources, which is something that picked up the original article in the Straits Times, and then they rewrote it under their own byline. You can see the byline is a reporter. The mothership is an online news source, which is very widely respected and used by, particularly by young Singaporeans. And you can see a picture of the Saiga and the cooling water. Just to test whether this thing about it being locally relevant is important, we did 2 adverts on Facebook, and here's a couple of the Facebook ads, one of which is a very generic one, the one on the right, and the one on the left talks about Chinese Singaporeans, otherwise the same. And you can see that the reach, the orange bar is the reach, and you can see much more reach to people who actually click through on this than on the locally based one than on the more generic one. So the next step is to monitor and evaluate. So we were monitoring the Facebook posts. I should say that what we got was nearly 500,000 people saw these adverts based upon, you know, a really small injection of those adverts. And nearly 500,000 Singaporeans in our target group saw them. Just the mothership one alone on Facebook, which we were able to track, about 27,000 people reposted or commented on that advert. And this was, again, a small, short survey. So really powerful. You can get really good take up from your target audience. And then this is just an analysis of the comments and reactions that people had on Facebook to the 4 main places which covered our story. So Lion City News is a Chinese language one. The mothership is the one I told you about. Nature Society Singapore is a conservation organization, and the new paper is a Malaysian paper. So interestingly, you can see that there's variation in the pro message versus the anti message. Most people were pro, but the Lion City News, which is the more traditional Chinese language one, was more anti message. And then Nature Society Singapore, not surprising, was more pro message. So the next step is, did it change behavior? We've got a paper about to come out on this, so watch the space. The answer I can give in the questions, and then to learn and adapt and do your interventions again. Okay, so this may be a long way from consumption of wildlife, but partly I did it because I think it's cool, and partly because it tells you some important lessons. And the first thing is that trying to ban trade in wildlife will only work if society changes its mind. Laws aren't enough, and you can see that from the pangolin work, because large numbers of people were still eating pangolin despite it being really quite illegal. The other thing is that because it's complicated in terms of who eats what and what counts as consumption and what counts as traditional medicine, a ban on trade in wildlife for food would only protect some species that are currently legally traded, because if it's illegal, it's already illegal. And that would be things like civets and bats potentially. It will not protect medicinal uses, so it won't change behavior for pangolins, saigers. As it happens, it won't change terrestrial species either, like turtles. It does include, however, captive bred wildlife, and that's a really interesting one, because China in particular has a really large industry. I had no idea before COVID about this. It has a really large industry of captive bred wildlife, including amphibians, reptiles, peacocks, things like that, for consumption. And that was actually instituted or encouraged by the Chinese government after an outbreak of bird flu. So it was encouraged by a previous zoonotic outbreak into humans. And so they decided it was safer to have stuff that was captive bred than wild caught in terms of disease risk for humans. And so it is now a $53 billion industry, of which about $13 billion and about 14 million people are in wildlife for consumption. So that's interesting. We haven't got enough research on this, but potentially captive bred wildlife is a welfare issue. It could be a disease risk. It's also a major source of livelihood, and it also is potentially diverting people from catching stuff in the wild. So things that are bred in captivity could be things that would otherwise have been caught from the wild. So it's really ambiguous as to whether banning captive bred wildlife trade is a good thing or a bad thing for conservation. Although on the bright side, the fact that this call for the ban happened did lead to Vietnam and China stepping up, and Thailand, I think, saying we're going to do better in terms of enforcing our laws. So that was a really good outcome. But basically, it requires changing a whole culture. It requires you to understand that culture in order to change it. Moving on quickly to Africa, where there'd be other consequences from a wildlife trade ban. Wild meat is much more kind of endemic within the African, particularly in Central Africa, within culture and livelihoods. It's an important component of household economies right across the continent, and a source of both protein and cash for poor rural households. It's also a major employer for a lot of people, and in particular, as you can see from these pictures, of women, because they tend to be the traders. It involves a wide range of species, and some of them are highly endangered, so the pangolins again, and some of them are vulnerable to hunting, like primates, but others are pretty ubiquitous. So the boy you see holding that up, that's a cane rat, and those are crop pests, and they trap them around the fields in order to protect their crops and then sell them. So it's a kind of really mixed picture all the way through to amphibians, you can see there. So one question is, could you not just ban the commercial trade to markets? And the problem there from the rural side is that hunting is partly for subsistence, but quite a lot of it is for cash income. And that cash is used for medicine bills, unexpected bills, school fees, so fees that come in a kind of unexpected way or at certain times, because you get your agricultural salaries, once a year, but your kind of wild meat can come in almost like a kind of cash machine in the forest. And this is just a set of hunters from a village in Equatorial Guinea, just to give you a flavour of the proportion of catch that's sold by these hunters. So only one person is completely commercial, 2 people are completely subsistence, and everybody else has some kind of mixed economy. Another thing that's important in Africa is that the role of wild meat in people's consumption is very different depending on whether you're in a city or in a rural area. So this is from some work in Gabon, where you can see the price of porcupine, which is a very common wild meat product, and frozen chicken, which is a cheap alternative. And what you can see at the kind of zero is Libreville, which is the main city. And you can see there that porcupine is expensive. Porcupine is a luxury good that people don't need to eat, and they eat because they like the taste. Whereas when you go to the rural areas, deep out in the village, it's actually the chicken that is expensive and the porcupine that's cheap. So the kinds of interventions you do in a city to try to reduce demand are going to be very different to the kinds of interventions you do in a rural area to try to reduce demand. A final thing I think it's really, really important to highlight is that we need to think through policy, and policy that's simple and that's a blanket policy almost always not going to work very well. And the best example that I've seen of this is a nice study that was done by a group led by Bonwit, so Bonwit et al. In Guinea in West Africa. And this was in the 2013 to 16 Ebola outbreak. And what they did was they went to evaluate the public health messaging that was put out by the public health authorities in Guinea to try to tell people how to avoid getting Ebola. And here is an example. And interestingly, what you can see is that the very first one is don't eat bushmeat. And it says don't eat bushmeat like bats, monkeys, and rodents. Then the other 2 are more standard kind of public health messaging, don't touch people who are ill. So interestingly, this kind of focus on bushmeat really, really backfired in this particular area. And that was for a number of reasons. Firstly, people eat bushmeat regularly in these areas, and their lived experience was that they were not getting Ebola from eating bushmeat. And that was correct, because although Ebola came originally from wildlife, once you have an epidemic, the actual transmission of Ebola, or any epidemic really, is person to person. It's not like the kind of source one. The source comes in from wildlife, and then the epidemic is person to person. So telling people to stop eating bushmeat really isn't going to affect their chances of getting Ebola during an Ebola epidemic. The second thing was that people were really suspicious that this was just a ploy by conservationists. So the outbreak happened near a protected area, and they knew that conservationists didn't want them going into the protected area to hunt bushmeat. And so they just said, well, the conservationists are just hijacking this public health messaging to try to stop us from going into the forest. And frankly, they were right. So in both cases, the local people seeing this messaging and feeling mistrust in external authorities were right to feel that. And what that meant was that actually they started to lose trust in the health authorities and the health people who were in there trying to help them. And they started not to cooperate so well with those health people. And so that was a massive unintended consequence on the public health side, but also in terms of conservation, because it then just meant that conservationists had lost some trust. So I think we really have to be careful when we mix up motivations when we're trying to do public health or any kind of intervention. So I think it's important really to think about what are the priorities behind the calls to ban wildlife markets. And the one that is put front and center is disease risk, and fair enough. You know, we do have instances of disease transfer to humans from wildlife in markets or around markets. Another priority that is not stated really, but is important, is animal welfare. And you know, these animals do suffer terribly in these markets. And there is a really good, strong overlap between disease risk and animal welfare, because if you have animals that are stressed and that are packed in together, their immune systems are compromised and they're more likely to spread disease. There's also the conservation aspect, and that's fine too. You know, there are species of conservation concern that are coming into these markets like pangolins. And then the final one is about livelihoods. And I think we have to remember that too, that there are people who are reliant on this trade. So there are 4 different kind of priorities that you try to balance when you try to have a policy intervention. So when you think about it in those terms, you can think through for a range of different species, how those might interact. And this is work that was led by Holly Booth, my student. So let's think, for example, about a gorilla. So what I've got here is the red means that the trade is a problem on this axis. The blue means ambiguous or neutral, and green means it's fine. So in the case of gorillas, you know, we have animal welfare issues. You know, they're snared in the forest, they're highly intelligent, but they shouldn't, you know, they're not species that should be hunted, in my view. They're highly endangered. There is a disease risk in both directions, actually, because they share diseases with humans. The wildlife trade is not a big issue for livelihoods because it's not a major source of food or livelihood. It tends to be commercial and opportunistic. So we would not really have an impact on the livelihoods of the poor by banning the trade. So overall, the thing with gorillas is that the trade is already banned everywhere. So there's no need to bring in new law. You just have to work hard to enforce the existing laws, and there should be no hunting or trade in gorillas. Here's another example, which is bats. So bats, we have a very strong issue of disease risks. They're the reservoir for many zoonotic diseases, and market diseases are likely to be highly risky. And we've seen this with a number of different diseases coming in from bats. In terms of welfare, well, they could be sold dead or cooked. They don't need to be sold live. So, but of course, there's a welfare issue of hunting. Conservation, meat consumption is probably not the worst threat that bats face, but there will be some species that for which it is a conservation issue. And again, for livelihoods, hunting may be for food or livelihood, but it's not a major traded taxon. So this is a species where it's currently often legal to hunt and trade. And in this case, you would recommend for public health reasons that the trade should be banned. Just going through a couple more. Frogs, very widely captive bred. And that captive bred trade is a livelihood for many. There's no known zoonotic issues in terms of humans. They could be kept relatively humanely. I reserve judgment on whether they are at the moment. In terms of conservation, the captive breeding is potentially taking pressure off the wildlife, but it could also be giving a disease risk to wild amphibians. So in this case, I think regulation, strong regulation, farm trade only for conservation reasons would be a way forward. My final example is the blue duiker, which is widespread, widely traded species in Africa. So this is something that's snared, which is a welfare issue, but it is sold dead. The harvest is likely to be sustainable because it's a fast-growing species. It's a major source of livelihood for many, and there's no known zoonotic issues of disease, and yet it's an important source of protein which keeps people healthy. So in this case, perhaps regulated trade for sustainability. Now, I'm not saying that these analyses are right, but I'm saying that, you know, when you start to kind of pass out the objectives, you can get perhaps a more nuanced risk-based approach around these objectives. So now I'm going to kind of zoom out a little bit and talk about wildlife trade more generally in Africa and how COVID-19 might have changed that trade. Because if we think about the sustainability of trade, it's set within an economic system. And COVID-19 is likely to have changed this a lot. And this is work that was led by James McNamara and with colleagues in Ghana and in Gabon. So we just did a kind of think piece. We did a kind of conceptual model to think through all the different ways in which COVID might be changing sustainability of hunting. And there's a number of different demand shocks that COVID might have put in place in these countries. The first one is the one I've just been talking about, is that awareness of zoonotic disease risk can be heightened, which could marginalize wild meat, change regulations, and potentially reduce bushmeat consumption, thereby reducing demand. But there's other kind of wider economic system shocks. So many countries in Africa are very highly dependent on their export markets of natural resources. They're also, obviously, just like in the UK, we've had supply chain shocks to do with COVID, which has changed prices, changes availability of various things. So there'll be commodity price shocks that aren't to do with wildlife, disruptions in export and import markets. Another big one is use of global transport, which has heavily declined, and many countries are reliant on oil as an export commodity, so that will be important. And then finally, the reduction in international travel is likely to have reduced visiting numbers, therefore reducing tourism revenues, which reduces government revenues and may potentially lead to inability to enforce your protected areas as well. So I think the kind of zoonotic disease risk and the international travel to conservation is relatively straightforward, but the kind of feeding through of these commodity prices and transport oil prices is more difficult. And particularly in Africa, what we get is that, as I showed you, urban and rural situations are very, very different. And so the effect of food price changes in urban and rural settings will be very different. And a particular thing is that many people in Central Africa are very still linked into their rural roots. And so when people lose employment or when they find it's hard to live in urban areas, they tend to go home to the rural areas. So then going home to rural areas is likely to potentially increase demand for wild meat in the rural areas, but also increase the number of hunters, because hunting is the fallback occupation. So these kind of things interact in a complicated way. And I'm just going to show you a couple of examples. So this is Ghana. And, you know, our experts who work in Ghana suggest that really the main thing that's going to affect wild meat hunting in Ghana is to do with these export markets, because coffee and cocoa are big exports. And if those markets are disrupted, we're likely to see, you know, substantial falls in urban disposable incomes, both through increase in food prices, but also unemployment, which is likely to lead to a reduction in this luxury urban demand, which could potentially lead to less bushmeat hunting actually on the ground. There might also be some kind of people going home to hunt, but that's likely to be less important. In Gabon, it's really different, because Gabon is an oil exporter, and so the fall in oil prices is likely to have substantially decreased government revenue, also likely to have had substantial falls in income, both urban and rural, which is likely to have led to what I said about people going home and starting to hunt more. So on balance, the suggestion there is that there might be more hunting in Gabon as a result of COVID. So hopefully those two things have illustrated some of the complexity of the systems-wide issues that COVID might produce, which would then lead to increases in unsustainable bushmeat hunting, in some cases at least. So to summarize, this section kind of calls to ban the commercial trade in wild animals for consumption look really attractive superficially, and I can see why people in the West are getting behind them. But there's so much underlying complexity, which means that these kind of bans that are kind of blanket, but at the same time not covering everything, are unlikely, I would say, to have the desired effect. And I think a risk-based approach that explicitly addresses these underlying priorities might be more appropriate. And we need more understanding of the drivers of wildlife trade, both at the individual level, why do people choose to consume or not, and at the systemic level, so that we can support better interventions. And finally, as I've just showed, COVID is likely to alter these drivers in quite complicated ways. So now I'm going to focus even further out and talk about, you know, how these kinds of ideas feed into the wider narrative about biodiversity. And of course, we all know that, you know, the threat to biodiversity is also a threat to humankind, and it affects us in numerous ways. And one way that I like to think about this is through the planetary boundaries approach that Kate Raworth initiated. And this says that what we've got is a social foundation of things that humanity needs, that every human being needs. So we all need health, we all need a political voice, and we all need housing, income and work. And the red is the extent to which we have a shortfall on those basic social foundations. However, we also have an ecological ceiling. We have planetary boundaries beyond which we can't go. So what we need to do, it's called donut economics, because we need to live in the green donut, where we're above the social foundation but below the ecological ceiling. And you can see here that, you know, we're breaching the ecological ceiling on a number of important things. So we're neither fulfilling the social foundation or staying within our ecological bounds. And what this means in terms of biodiversity, which you saw was massively into the red, is that we're losing large amounts of biodiversity. So in my lifetime, for example, the Living Planet Index suggests that we have lost 68% of the global terrestrial wild vertebrates in terms of individuals. And that is due to a massive conversion of wildlife into both us, but more importantly, into our domestic livestock. So for mammals, we've got now 4% of the global mammal population is wild, 60% is livestock. If we think about birds, it's 70% poultry, 30% wild birds. So that's a huge kind of shift of the kind of productivity of the earth towards us. Interestingly, if you look at this broken down regionally, you can see that in some areas, the reduction in the Living Planet Index is flatter, in some areas really, really steep. But the drivers are the same all the way, really. So the purple in the pie charts is land use change, and that is mostly for agriculture, which is mostly for livestock, or the food to feed livestock for our meat consumption. Then about 20 to 25% is overexploitation, and that is actually mostly timber and fish. And then there's some other bits and pieces that are important, more or less important in different places. Climate change is not yet a big driver, but it's kind of coming up there. So that leads to the kind of quite nice framing that WWF started and is now gaining a lot of traction, which is what is our challenge as humanity over the next decade or so. And what we need to do is to be able to feed the 9 billion people who we expect to have on the planet in 2050 or so. More than that, though, we need to give people a decent life. We need to be above that social threshold. We also need to keep climate change below 1.5 degrees, or 2 if we can't make that, so that we don't have catastrophic climate change. We also need to restore nature so that our planet functions in a healthy way. So our challenge is to meet those 3 different objectives in a way that actually works. And I guess as a researcher, I've thought a lot about what do we need to do as researchers? And I think a really important thing is to provide evidence about what works and what doesn't, and about the effects of human activities on nature. And so, what I've been saying about wild meat and wild meat trade and what would work and what wouldn't is kind of part of that, which would then enable you to focus on the key issues. And for me, despite being a wildlife trade researcher who's been working on that for 30 years, I think the key issue, if we were going to focus on one, would be agricultural, and it would be how are we actually going to feed people in a sustainable way? And that affects both biodiversity and climate change. And then we as researchers have to engage widely to support a change in societal norms and give regulators and businesses the information and the push to make the change. Whether we also need to act more directly is a challenge which I'm still working through. So I've been really depressed actually through COVID. I mean, not for many reasons, as we all are, but one of them is that I don't think that we as conservationists are stepping up to that challenge. We haven't over the last few months stepped up to that challenge. So one way in which we haven't stepped up to the challenge is this thing about wildlife trade. And the other way is other kinds of distractions. So a big push in terms of the conservation messaging that's gone out in Western Europe and North America is around, for example, and this is just one example, trophy hunting. So let's kind of change our relationship to nature and stop a few people who we might not agree with. I don't agree with trophy hunting, but a few people hunting lions. That is not going to solve our systemic problems for how to conserve the planet. So we have, for example, these big rows on social media about some people saying, let's ban trophy hunting, and then other people saying, this is a letter from indigenous groups in Namibia to celebrities, basically saying, butt out, you don't really understand what we're doing. I mean, whether or not, whichever of the side you are of the argument you're on, I think you can say that this is a side issue. It may be very important to some people, some places, but it's not the main issue. And also it becomes very unpleasant. So this is my colleague, Amy Dickman, who is a lion biologist who spent her working life conserving lions and happens to engage on Twitter quite a lot on this topic. And she gets absolutely trolled, and it's just not the way forward, really. The other thing we're doing, which I also think is wrong, depressing, annoying, is as scientists, what we tend to do is set ourselves on the moral high ground and spend our time wagging our finger at the rest of humanity and saying how wrong we are. So here's an example of that kind of thing, in which the scientists are giving a warning to humanity and giving a second notice to humanity. And I don't think that despite attracting a lot of attention, is the more constructive way forward. What it does do, this kind of finger wagging and raising fears, is that it makes people aware of the issues. And the issues are big, the issues are important, and it's important that people go out and they do protest and they do feel angry. But we can't just have anger, and you can't just have blame, because they don't work. So if you have too much anger and too much blame, people will switch off. And there's quite a lot of psychology literature that says truly scary information has a nasty tendency to get ignored. Why would you think about the way we're destroying the planet when you can comfort yourself by watching Netflix instead? And so how do we actually make a more sustainable, make a more, basically a more sustainable change in the way that we engage with the public? Because what we want in the end is to have every member of the public, whatever they do, wherever they live, to feel like they have a stake in conservation. And these are they're not actually random members of the public, they're members of my family who I've made to do it. But, just to give an example of the kinds of breadth of profession that we need to have involved. So that is why in 2017, I founded something called Conservation Optimism, which is a way to not shirk the fact that we have major issues, not shy away from the fact that things really need to change, but frame it in a way that is action orientated. So for every kind of negative thing, you have a positive as well. And then recently, during COVID, during lockdown, I founded something called Pledge for Our Future, which I know that Mark signed because I see him quite often on there, which helps you to say what you're going to do and then hopefully be able to live up to it. So all of these things may or may not help. And I think sometimes as conservationists, we can feel like we're just, dragging through the mud, wading through treacle, and nothing is changing however much we push. And when we think about that, I really like to look at this diagram because I find it very comforting. So this is American states that brings various kind of socially liberal bits of legislation into legislation. It doesn't really matter what the legislation is. What matters is that it was something that was not perhaps part of the discourse to start with. And the kind of top grey line is the number of states in the USA. This is all the way from 1787. And the different coloured lines are the numbers into which it goes into legislation. And then the balls at the end are when it's gone into federal law, and therefore the battle's won. And what you see is lots and lots and lots of nothing happening. So silence, 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 as society gets to the point at which you can have this exponential change. So the point at which the social norm has changed to the extent to which legislation can be put into place. So the question then to us as conservationists is, how far are we? The extent, how far are we along this? Are we still in the kind of pottering along and nothing's really changing? Or are we about to see a step change? Of course, I hope that we are about to see that step change in the way in which society thinks about these issues, so that governments can then act. And here's one of the reasons why I think it might be happening. So, 2 years ago, we had one Swedish girl sitting outside her parliament. And then within a few months, we had a real take up of that message. So here we've got South Africa, we've got New Zealand, we've got New York, and we've got Delhi. and Afghanistan, where you'd think that, you know, there was a lot of other things that were on people's minds, but there were still kids who were prepared to go out and march for climate change. So you know, big change in the way that people are thinking about things. It also happens in more kind of policy arenas. So here is the World Economic Forum's 2020 assessment of global risks. And on the x-axis is the likelihood of the risk, and on the y-axis is the impact of the risk if it should happen. And I think this was done before COVID, by the way, because infectious diseases are kind of out of place. But what you can see here is that over the 3 years, 2018, 19, 20, biodiversity loss has kind of crept really heavily up there and is now in the top right-hand quadrant, which is, you know, the major risks, the highly likely and highly impactful. So people are becoming aware at these very high levels that biodiversity loss is an existential risk, which is great. It's not great that it's an existential risk, but it's great that they care. And kind of based around that, the World Economic Forum did an assessment of dependence on biodiversity. You can read it. You know, there's various things that show that they're starting to be aware of the importance of biodiversity for economic value generation. You know, more than 50% of the world's total GDP is moderately or highly dependent on biodiversity and its services. And, you know, one that might strike a bit close in the boardroom, 60% of coffee varieties are threatened with extinction, potentially destabilizing the supply of coffee, which is what keeps the boardrooms going. These are rough estimates, they're underestimates, and actually in the next 12 months, we're going to have better ones coming through. Things like the Dasgupta review, which is commissioned by the UK government. So getting towards the end now, in principle, 2020 was supposed to be the year in which everything happened. You know, we had the climate change conventions, the biodiversity conventions being renegotiated, world leaders, businesses actually committing to doing something differently. Well, 2020 is about to stop and we haven't had these conferences yet, but I think that's great because actually we've had more time to prepare. And I think in 2021, we can have much more impact in getting a new framework for governments to sign up to and changing the way they think about biodiversity. So I'm just going to end on a bit of a hopeful note, which comes from the Conservation Optimism Summit about why people feel like they're conservation optimists. So I'm a conservation optimist because of all the people I meet who are so committed to conservation. You can't see the top of the mountain if it's covered by clouds. Perseverance is the key, and I believe we are here to win the battle. The world needs me to believe, and because I need to believe. Without optimism, there would be no conservation. If everyone is contributing to the movement, we can truly make the world a better place. Humans don't want to live alone. I have seen evidence we can make a difference. These two people got on a plane for the first time to come and share what works in Moroccan environmental activism. And my favourite, trees make me smile. So thank you, and I hope that was interesting.
EJ, thank you immensely for an incredibly timely, fascinating, wide-ranging, thought-provoking talk. That's wonderful. There have been quite a few questions and comments. Are you happy to take a look through the comments, or would you like me to do so? And some of them are not questions, some of them are comments, but the questions go way back.
Why don't you choose a couple?
Sure. Okay, so there was a question quite a while back, which was from, oh, there we go. From Karen Blackport, who says, is it true to say, and you may come onto this, that there are sometimes deep cultural beliefs in respect to the fact that people prefer products from a wild animal rather than a captive or substitutes, as the belief is that the non-wild sources are seen as substandard in some way?
Yes, for some species that is the case. How malleable they are is interesting, and I think sometimes we underestimate the importance of cultural beliefs, and sometimes we overestimate them. And I think you know, we've done quite a lot of work on bear bile, for example, which is something that is seen as much more potent from the wild. But now there's synthetic alternatives available. There's also farmed bear bile. And we did some quite extensive work with Chinese people to try to understand what would make them switch between those three, if they would switch, you know, and how they felt about the different things. And actually there's more capacity for people to switch than you might think. Even though people might think that wild is better, it doesn't mean that they would necessarily be averse to switching. So I think there are deep cultural beliefs, and we do have to recognize, understand, and work with local people to address those. But I don't think the deep cultural beliefs are prevalent and inflexible enough not to make it possible to do a sustainable wildlife and captive bred potentially, and synthetic, or shift onto other things. I mean, in our country, we have what one might think of as deep cultural beliefs that are now no longer relevant.
Thank you, E.J. Another question about culture. This is a question from Laura, who asks, in what multi-layered ways are you understanding the cultures deeply in order to change them? Remembering that the way we know, think, and change is from our perspectives, it is important to understand our own positionality, e.g. Western neoliberal, and reflect on this while planning and carrying out action.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I really couldn't agree more. And I think certainly if you're talking about something like traditional Chinese medicine, there is no point in going on in saying, this is fingernails, it won't work. The only way in which you can engage with TCM practitioners, for example, is to actually talk to them, listen to them, and have change come from within. Change doesn't come from external interventions, generally speaking. So yes, I agree with you.
Thanks, E.J. There are quite a few comments, but I'm going to focus on the questions, if that's okay. People can read the comments if they wish, but I'll ask another question. And this question comes from Benjamin Shaw, who asks, in relation to the Singapore case, how did people respond/interpret the social media messaging? Was there a delay before behavioral change was noticed? I'm also interested to know how you had belief that this digital approach would work. Are there any similar studies/papers that encouraged you?
So to answer the second one, no, I mean, it was research, and so we tried it out. So I guess we knew that people, you know, there's quite a lot of work about complex contagions, which is about how you have to how people have to see things from multiple sources, and also how people have to see things from trusted sources, and in order to change behaviors. So we were taking the kind of understanding about complex contagions and applying that to our case, because our kind of prior work made it clear that people would need to have some kind of trusted information, and behavior change tends to come from these kinds of complex contagions rather than simple contagions, which is just information sharing. We also knew that people in Singapore are very connected online, and that they trust online sources, and they go and look for information online. And we also knew that you know, in other fields, people have used Google ads and Facebook ads to make change in society, but we hadn't seen it done in conservation before. How did people respond and interpret the social media messaging and the delays? So the behavioral change, there was very little behavioral change, I would say. So this was a short, in fact, I know because we did the analysis, this was a short and targeted campaign. We got a lot of engagement. We got a lot of pledges to change, but we did a survey before and after and found very little evidence of change in behavior. There was some. We also did a shopkeeper survey, and they also didn't really see much change in the way that the consumers actually worked. So whether that was because it was too small, whether that's because it hasn't played through yet, I'm not sure.
Thanks, E.J. the majority of the rest of the comments are either debates around trophy hunting, or talking about animal welfare, or talking about some of the theoretical background to some of the things that you mentioned. And we're also coming towards the end of time. So I guess I just wanted to throw open to you. The conservation optimism and the pledge for future, are those things that the people listening can get involved in? Are they up and running?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy just to briefly. So in terms of the planetary boundaries, yes, I didn't mean to say that the planetary boundaries were Kate Raoult's idea. The donut economics was Kate Raoult's idea. So they're quite right to say it's Roxham and Fock. And in terms of trophy hunting, obviously this is an incredibly contentious issue, and a complex issue, and one in which, you know, it's not straightforward. I think one thing I would say is that the reason why Amy Dickman gets involved in this is that she works in the Ruaha ecosystem in Tanzania, which has, in which trophy hunting does provide funding for local people and for conservation. And it's pretty clear that in the absence of, currently, in the absence of trophy hunting, there would be more agricultural expansion, more snaring, more poisoning, and that is a worse way to die than being hunted. And so I think everybody who's a conservationist wants to stop trophy hunting, including me, Amy, everybody else. I don't want to see trophy hunting going into the next decade. But what I don't think is a good idea is to stop trophy hunting in the absence of an alternative. So, and that alternative has to be locally defined. It has to be something that local people have been involved in thinking about, deciding upon, and not just imposed on people. And it needs to be up and working and sustainable before you take away the source of income that is stopping people from snaring and expanding. So I think that it's a sequencing question, and it's about making sure that local people actually have those alternatives. And of course there's corruption, and of course there's a lack of benefits transfer, and of course it only, you know, particularly in Tanzania. So I would say that it's not a straightforward issue, and I guess my call is for, similarly to my call about blanket bans on wildlife trade, it's very rare that something that is imposed from outside on the basis of a kind of relatively simplistic analysis actually works on the ground. That's it, really. In terms of, what was the question? Oh, conservation optimism. I mean, I think we could go on discussing trophy hunting forever. Conservation optimism, always looking for volunteers, always looking for people to spread the word. Pledge for our future, go in and pledge if you like it, spread the word, tell people. These are both meant to be inclusive, positive ways that people can actually make their own individual contribution and feel better. Actually, conservation optimism I love, because every Monday it gives you a nice bit of motivation. And if you feel depressed, down, you know, ground down by conservation, which happens often, go to conservation optimism and read some happy stuff and make you feel better.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, EJ. We've already kind of gone over time a little bit, and there are still quite a few comments and questions. Would you like for me to kind of take a copy of the comments and pass those on to you?
Yeah, that'd be great. Yes, and thanks to everyone for engaging so kind of energetically and constructively.